And as said, thanks for the invitation, which certainly underlines the partnership that we've had for the last couple of years between the institute that I direct and the wonderful things taking place in Cape Town, not least this annual festival. I really enjoy the diversity of what I've seen thus far. And was slightly amazed, if not stunned, by Denise's talk this morning. Had a subject that's very close to my heart about sampling, but she started it off with a fairly old citation of mine, which is totally relevant to this talk. It was as if she knew I was going to talk about it. And to underline that diversity, Jeremy almost excused himself when he started his talk about how different it was because we jumped from sounds to notes. And that's very much along the lines of what we're going to be talking about here. So after having spoken with you, Theo, about what might be best for this year's event, you signaled to me that talking about maybe some of the folklore between note-based music and all that goes with it, and the training that goes with it, and the same thing with sound-based music and the tensions between them. I came up with this title, the title in which the word just is within brackets, and that is within brackets because theoretically that word just might be removed. So moving right along, I sent you, Theo, an abstract, but I don't believe the others have seen it. And I think by reading through this, you'll get an idea about what's coming up. In the journey for most composers of electroacoustic music, one moves from the music of notes to the music made with sounds that are not identified as notes. In my case, I was traditionally educated in music and at one point became a sound-based musician, focusing on the use of sonic samples. As Hegel speaks of thesis, within music, let's call that notes, to antithesis, sounds that are not notes, perhaps the ultimate goal is synthesis, that is music using notes and those other sounds. This talk discusses the fact that the sound-based music paradigm of knowledge, I'll tell you what that means shortly, that this overlaps with the note-based one we learn in music education, but is also distinct in other ways. Being aware of both might lead to the truly emancipated musician who makes today's and tomorrow's music using any sonic material, benefiting from musical traditions and both sonic and technological developments. So that's what the next 18 or so minutes are going to be about. Well, to start, in 2007, in a book, I created the term sound-based music. What does this mean, and why did I feel I needed this term? Well, I've already given away what I think it means. Sound-based music is music made with sounds that were not originally intended to be notes. Now, you can come back and say all notes are sounds, and that's true, and that's perhaps one reason why this term is not ideal and potentially ephemeral, but it's being used around the globe now, and I guess the point that I wanted to make has been made. But why did I feel I needed it? One of the main reasons behind this was that, for example, in the US, electronic music is used both in the sense of what we heard in Hubert Howe's talk, synthesis, and in the sense of electroacoustic music, a term we use in Europe, and I've heard used often enough today in South Africa to know that that is in use. And therefore, there's some ambiguity in terminology. What's also relevant is that some electroacoustic music is note-based, and therefore, for me, doesn't necessarily qualify, and therefore was not an ideal term for what I wanted to talk about in that book. Sonic art, or sometimes put in the plural sonic arts, is a very useful term because that consists almost solely of sound-based music. The problem is, as we'll return to in a few minutes' time, is the word art. This gives people the excuse to say that that thing that they're listening to is not music because it's made with sounds. I suggest, in contrast, that such works are music, and they may be something else as well, such as an art installation that involves sound. But opera is a Gesamtkunst type of music, which involves theater, dance, and music. Nobody complains about that. So that's just a little bit of a basis for this talk. Having created a sound, this led me to concluding that a sound-based music paradigm exists alongside the better-known note-based music paradigm. In fact, nobody ever calls it that because we just assume that there's knowledge common to note-based types of music. What is the sound-based music paradigm, and to what extent does it overlap with the former, and to what extent is it independent from it? Well, I decided to use this overused word paradigm because it embraces that which we do when we produce sound-based music, that which we know when we theorize about sound-based music, that which we do when we disseminate sound-based music, and that what we do when we discuss the appreciation of sound-based music. So the paradigm wraps all of that up. And when you think about your note-based training, that's identical. But they are not the same. And that was pointed out very clearly through the first two talks today. Nonetheless, I really enjoyed Jeremy's talk because he was talking about closure. And that, of course, is a term that is equally relevant to both types, sound-based and note-based music. But because he was dealing with non-tonal music, which is another antithesis, it became a relevant subject to investigate, as it is with the kind of musics that I'm involved with. So they have an overlap, but they have very, very different elements, and technology is playing, obviously, a much bigger role in most sound-based music than it does in a lot of note-based music. But that's a generalization, and there are exceptions. So let's take a step backwards here and discuss traditional music training, as in how I was taught. And I think one can easily separate that into two parts. That which is trained through the ear, and that which is trained through what we call music literacy. Let's summarize that through the use of scores. Scores that can be performed, scores that can be analyzed, and so on and so forth. Obviously, there are many traditions of music that don't involve scores. You can score those kinds of music, but their evolution is largely based on the oral transmission from musician to musician, from generation to generation, from culture to culture. We all know this, and I'm stating things that are pretty obvious. But what's interesting here is that music literacy and sound-based music can mean a lot of different things. And a lot of our working, although we may use formalisms to produce the music, is orally determined. And I would hope that for people working with notes that takes place as well. Moving on, I think it's important with this subject that we emphasize a number of the musical and extra-musical revolutions that took place in the 20th century and obviously continue in the current one. This is going to happen at a very rapid pace, not least because of the 20-minute duration of this talk, but we cannot underestimate some of them. The first that I wrote is technology with recording in brackets, because the introduction of various technologies from the early 20th century and the fact that you didn't have to be present to hear music, which was never the case before then, is perhaps the biggest revolution of all. It has impacted every variety of music and every aspect of music, its distribution, its consumption, and so on and so forth. Again, this is perfectly obvious. And thus, the surge of various forms of commercial music rose above more traditional varieties. Another revolution was atonality, which again, as I've mentioned already, is a kind of an antithesis, where tonality is the thesis or modality. We also have the loosening of structure, of meter, of the materials you can use in sound sources. And in the world of electroacoustic music, we have parametric continuities, which were alluded to in Hubert Howe's talk. So it's any pitch, it's any loudness, it's any duration, and so on and so forth. We are therefore, as musicians, confronted with infinite choice, and thus, sadly, many types of music that are at best an acquired taste. Let me pause for a second. This is perhaps the most important sentence in my talk. It's not only sound-based music that has been marginalized because it hasn't quite found its way into the mainstream, although by stealth you can find it in sound design, in computer games, used often in movies, and in a heck of a lot of music as well. But equally in note-based contemporary music, there's a lot of music that has never reached the public because it is, in fact, an acquired taste, and perhaps more difficult for people that don't have any experience in it. So I just underline that as we move forward. And look at a remark. Oh, wait, have I just skipped something? Oh, yes. The final section of this one. Formalized music is a good example to discuss with respect to what I was just talking about. You can formalize music, as we well know, people like Xenakis, in instrumental music, but you can equally do it in sound-based music. Are the formalizations that are used the same? Well, outside of music, the way you can use numbers and algorithms and the like, yes, indeed. But the way it works in sound-based music is largely different, not least because of the continuities available, not least because of the infinite material available, and all sorts of other things. So it's not only the fact that it's digital art aspect that separates formalized sound-based musical knowledge from note-based varieties, it's also those parametric continuities and the use of space, the digital tools that we have available, and much more. So returning to the title, a former colleague of mine and author of the fairly well-known book, The Digital Musician, Andrew Hugill, once just said to me, after I had created the term sound-based music, note-based music, sound-based music, isn't it just music? And I thought, well, yes, but I have a feeling we're a long way from that. And before I return to that, I want to tell a short story that took place before apartheid was no more. I was in a train in Germany, and sitting across from me in a coupe was a white South African. And because we were a long distance between stations and he was a bit of a chatterbox, he asked me what I did. And I said I was a musician and I was working on a piece of theater in Germany, thus the travel on the train. And he said, do you know South African music? And I said, I know it quite well. And he asked me, what do you think of the Black people's drumming music? There's no melody and there's no harmony. It's not music, really, is it? I said, well, there's two things I have to reply. Number one, there are usually or often melodies in the heads of the people playing the percussion because that may be at the base of it. At least in West Africa, that is often the case. Number two, damn well it is music. Everything that's musical is in it. You're missing your melodies and your harmonies. But for me, it's got the body moving, it's got the emotions moving, and it's got every element of music that I need. So actually, what is music is in the mind of the beholder. And that's one of the morals to today's story. What we need to get sound-based music and some new forms of note-based music more appreciated is for people to understand what's musical in all of these things and how they can connect with it. So I agree with Andrew Hugill's idea that it's just music, and it's not unimportant, but as you're going to find out in the rest of this talk, we're not quite there yet. Therefore, the issue is not solely potentially alienating content, it's also cultural resistance. Something that we do not spend sufficient time investigating, both in education, in our research, and our connection with all sorts of media, and we need to do something about that. So following this logic, one often speaks of so-called communities of practice, which is a term from a gentleman called Wenger, and communities of interest. So these are groups of people that share interest in a way of making music, and groups of people that share an interest in certain types of music or approaches. Obviously, anyone can belong to a number of these. However, those interested in sound-based music, unless primarily focused on mixed music and the like, or electronic note-based music, which in my view is not sound-based, do feel an allegiance to non-note-based varieties as well, although they're most likely to enjoy the note-based varieties in a different way. In other words, we have a way of reacting to sound-based music that might be inherently different, and we don't normally, although again there are exceptions, pull the two together. In sum, Hegelian synthesis, also known in our case as just music, seems like a healthy goal. But this would involve more people first finding an appreciation for, and then a greater understanding of sonic creativity. And also, to be honest, many sorts of new note-based music that are really appreciated by a very small elite public. This brings me to last year's BE22 talk, where I focused on the notion of art for life's sake as an alternative to art for art's sake. Through shared lived experience, we can open the door to appreciation and understanding, as I have attempted to do in various of my applied research initiatives, and obviously in my music, thus allowing people to have an equal understanding of both note-based and sound-based musics, and consequently enabling them to eventually achieve that synthesis after all. Now, going back to Denise, who kicked off BE23, the samples that she was using and talking about did involve those connections. And so I think it illustrates the point I'm trying to make very well. However, to be honest, we're not there yet with this just music for most people. This continues to be the case due to the huge barriers created over the last 120 years against those musical revolutions, and therefore against an ethos of inclusivity related to all sorts of music creativity, as opposed to that kind of in-crowd culture that we unfortunately see across the globe still in terms of many sorts of new music making, particularly innovative sorts, whether they're sound or note-based today. There is still much work that needs to be done. Dear Boat Electrons people, this was a food for thought talk. I haven't really talked about my work because you're going to get a couple of pieces in just over an hour. But I hope this opens the doors for discussions, particularly among students who may be questioning some of the types of music that they're introduced to and connecting with it and trying to find means to get in or means to find their own voices. This idea of making links with lived experience to make innovative note-based and innovative sound-based music open to a larger audience has been the most important goal I've set for myself in my career, and I hope many of you will agree with that. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Thank you.
I think before we make time for room for questions, Leigh, thank you so much. You do not understand, you cannot understand how important this interaction with you is for me and for us. Never in my wildest dreams that I think that I'd be speaking with the person whose books I'd been, devouring for many years. So thank you so much for making time. It is deeply and warmly appreciated. From the floor, any questions? William, I think we can hear you from where you're sitting, right?
I'll try my best. Yeah, I can see that we can hear it. I hope that's okay. Yeah. I'll also just draw attention to the question in the chat that popped up at the bottom. But Leigh is cutting his ears, so I'll move
You better move.
closer. Just sit here and be disembodied. Thank you, Leigh, for a really, really wonderful talk. I'm struck by this example of the man sitting on the train and kind of asking, but is this music? And I do sometimes wonder how often we, on the sort of the more experimental side of the train track, as it were, sometimes ask that question of forms of popular music, right? And in the last year or so, I've been really astounded by some of the musical examples that my students bring to class. And even though they come from fairly established record labels and so on, I can't help but be kind of caught by the timbral thinking in some of the mixing practices, some of the equalization practices, some of the vocal treatments and so on. And I sometimes catch myself thinking, wait a sec, this is really, really strange. This is sound-based music, to use your term. Once I kind of forget to listen to the melody, but the sort of treatment, lo-fi filters on vocal lines and things like that, I sort of think, this is somebody thinking about sound, not somebody thinking just about music. So my question is kind of, how far, I mean, are we as experimentalists kind of thinking of finding sound-based music out in the wilds of the popular culture arena, as it were, and thinking about that as just music? Maybe provocative in that sense. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it's quite right that you bring up the number of our students today that are coming from popular music backgrounds, and how interesting it is that although, and I don't know what your experience has been, but often when we get new students in with popular music backgrounds, you ask them, how important is originality to you? And 1 out of 30 may raise a hand begrudgingly. And yet, by stealth, things like this, that which you just described about the timbral aspects, some of the sound sources that come up, or in club music, the amount of sound-based stuff that's used as an intro before the boop, boop, boop kicks off, and then it just goes the way it goes. The use of innovations that have come through both note-based and sound-based music that have found ways of permeating this stuff is astonishing. It's a question in my mind of awareness, and I think most musicians, particularly those studying, are aware that they're doing it. But they might not place it as we might, looking at composers like Ligeti and the like. And I think it's those crossovers, those means towards awareness with the sonic, with the timbral, and with all these other things. I mean, let's face it, it took over 30 years for the innovations that we discovered on the fly with spatialization are now quite present at pop festivals around the globe. And the idea of immersion as an experience has been taken over by pop music. What's equally interesting is that how many innovations in pop music, such as sampling culture, have found their way back into experimental music. It's that conversation that I think is going to open the door, particularly for students, that there's an awareness that there is interesting stuff happening in their world, and why don't they look into it as well?
Absolutely, thank you.
If I may add to that, personally, this is a personal point of view, it's not gospel, I'm super excited about the convergence between pop production in many different musical styles and Lachenmann's sound ideals and sound types. I think there is so much very natural overlap between those two worlds, and it is intensifying, and that excites me. The other thing that excites me is this this explosion in recomposition practices. I mean, Deutsche Grammophon, for example, bringing out a series, and it's continuing, a serious recomposition series, and it's extremely popular. One can debate if there is such a thing as quality in these recomposition attempts. One can debate, issues of originality, etc., but it's an exploding activity, and so those two things, this merger between what ostensibly has been viewed as niche composition practice and popular culture in terms of processing, but also in terms of composition, recomposition. I find that very, very interesting. Last word about that, once again from my personal sort of pedestal, is that I think the divisions that do still exist between groups of people who engage in activities involving these practices, those divisions are stoked by market forces. They're artificial divisions. Because you have to figure out a way to market revolutions and evolutions in music that in streams, musical streams that stand out. So nothing against marketing and nothing against Spotify and Apple Music, etc. But I do think that there's a wonderful future awaiting composers because there's an acute awareness of, hey, we're actually doing the same thing. My DJing on a Saturday night is actually the same filtering I'm using when I'm performing Microfonie 1. And that I find personally quite exciting.
And these are new media techniques that just permeate across the arts, Theo. So you're absolutely correct in that. Just a short word about what you just said. The originality and the copying and everything that goes with recomposition is one of the most active and valid subjects going on today. The legality questions that Denise alluded to, and I talk about hugely in my latest book, absolutely huge. The craft versus originality and innovation, and how that finds its way into different sorts of music, you know, a huge discussion. And the longer we don't directly address that, the longer we won't have a public. So I think it's getting that communication going that's urgent.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, William pointed out a question in the chat. Now I'm unable to see it from my vantage point.
Oh, I've got it here. Do you think that there is a universally understood description for music as an acquired taste? I think there was probably a universally understood description, but I don't think the acquired taste is universal. I mean, the acquired taste metaphor I often use is that I don't think I've ever met a child who likes to drink bitter lemon. And there are very few adults who don't like it. And maybe if we get to late Beethoven and some of those more complex works, you could start talking about what an acquired taste is. I was trained, now you get the autobiographical, at a university that was into second generation atonality in a big way. And I just saw a lot of people who we as students brought into concerts just not getting it, not enjoying it, and not finding a way into it, which is not to say that there's anything wrong, but they don't know the pathway that leads towards that appreciation. And that's where the acquisition of taste becomes relevant. And that's also true when you're presented with a sound-based piece and you don't have a context for it. So you might immediately engage with it, but you don't know what it is. And so you have to acquire a context for it.
There is an additional question in the chat, I believe.
No.
Good. Please, go ahead.
Hi there, Leigh. I just had a question in terms of how important is collaboration when it comes to finding that just music, or getting to that stage. How important is it for one group of people, who might be more into note-based music, or if we take popular music, and bring this about of electroacoustic music? How important is it to merge or mix when it comes to forming groups of making music together?
How interestingly put. It's a difficult question to answer, but I'm going to go back to my talk because I very consciously avoided collaboration this time. I often talk about collaboration when I'm talking about sampling, but instead talked about communities of practice and communities of interest, interest. And through becoming involved in different communities of practice and of interest, you learn more about the alternative modes of appreciation and of making. And I think where people are open to become immersed in something new, that working with or enjoying with somebody from another community of interest is a great way in. But if you want the God's honest truth, the answer to that is, if all these things were presented in lower education, people would know that they exist, and they would start acquiring a taste for it much earlier. And by the time they come to the University of Cape Town, they're well equipped and ready to go. But we're doing catch up in undergraduate education because the schools still haven't opened their minds to this in general.
Thank you.
Leigh, I think it's not for want of questions, but I think we have to say thank you very much. I do hope that you are available on the 9th of September. The next recording session has been booked. Prof. Landy is working on a composition for Prof. Plaatjes, and we're having an online, not jam, but an online practice session and exploration session. Having these on a regular basis actually will be the cherry on top. Leigh, we speak soon. Take care, and thank you so much.
Can't wait, and congratulations for everything so far, Theo. I hope that the rest of the festival goes brilliantly.